All right. Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. Hard to believe our last Under the Buffalo of this season. But I know you will be treated to a fantastic Under the Buffaloes next season as well, so have no fear. Well, good evening, everyone, officially, and welcome to the Evanston History Center's April 2022 Under the Buffalo presentation. I'm Eden Jerome Perlman, Executive Director of the History Center, and I would like to welcome everyone. This is our final UTB event for the season, and we want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and also wish to celebrate a most successful season of inspiring and thought-provoking talks. Since August of last year, we've hosted 8 online presentations covering a range of topics, from the filibuster in the US Senate to America's first civil rights movement. Many of our programs are available on our YouTube channel, and we'll post the link in our chat. Before introducing our speaker tonight, let me just say a quick word about some of our exciting upcoming programs. This year, the Evanston History Center's 47th annual Mother's Day House Walk will be a house walk by again this year. It will feature what's different, new and exciting. It will feature a week's worth of programming, which begins on Saturday, May 7th. For the first time in the walk's 47-year history, we will explore the Oakton Historic District. The week of programming will include self-guided tours of the featured neighborhood, that's the house walk by, a Zoom presentation with preservation experts, homeowners, and architects, a lecture about the CTA Yellow Line, that will be held at the Dawes House, docent-led walking tours of the Oakton Historic District, and of course, EHC's signature house walk book. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year, and we hope you will join us. More information and tickets can be purchased on our website, evanstonhistorycenter.org. And now I am delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Scott Mehaffey. He is the Executive Director at the Edith Farnsworth House, a National Historic Site located in Plano, Illinois. Scott has a 30-year career of public and private sector leadership focused in the Chicago area. His former positions with the Morton Arboretum and the City of Chicago have included historic site management, strategic planning and development, and community outreach and programming. In addition, he is an adjunct professor in the College of Architecture at Illinois Institute of Technology, which, as many of us know, most of the buildings were, of course, designed by Mies van der Rohe. At IIT, Scott teaches graduate level courses in modernism and the Prairie School. Most recently, Scott headed his own landscape architecture firm based in Flossmoor, Illinois, and led efforts to revitalize the historic commercial district in Princeton, Illinois. He holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Illinois College of Fine and Applied Arts, and a Master's of Science in Organizational Leadership from Dominican University. He has been active in the field of cultural landscape preservation and architectural history, and is a frequent speaker, writer, and tour guide on these subjects. He has also held leadership positions with the American Public Gardens Association and the American Society of Landscape Architects. We are all looking forward to his talk this evening about the Edith Farnsworth House, a renowned international style house. As you may know, the house was commissioned by Dr. Edith Farnsworth, a prominent Chicago medical doctor, musician, and poet. The house was designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe between 1945 and 1951. One quick note, after Scott's presentation, we'll have, we'll have question and answers. If you have a question, You may use the chat feature and type your question there, or if you prefer to ask your question live, please let us know by raising your hand in the feature, the Zoom feature, and then when we call on you, you can unmute your microphone and join us for the presentation. So I know we are all excited, so I will turn it over to Scott. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eden. Can everybody see me and hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to present to you this evening. I was telling Jenny and Eden that I used to live in Evanston. I've actually lived in Evanston twice. Right after graduate school, I was living in a sublet on Ridge, just south of Noyes, and that was a lot of fun. And then years later, I bought a condominium in the Rozak building at 1415 Sherman. So that was a nice 5 years too. I really enjoyed Evanston. I live in Flossmoor now because you can get a lot more bang for your buck in Flossmoor than in Evanston. I don't probably need to tell you, but yeah, I've lived in a number of historic communities around the Chicagoland area and really loved Evanston. So I'll just dive right into the slides here. Okay, can everybody see them okay? Fine, okay, terrific.
It's perfect, Scott, perfect.
All right, terrific. So this is our newly updated logo. We have officially added Edith's first name to the Farnsworth House after 20 some years of being open to the public. Well, nearly 20 years, I should say. And that was because a lot of people would come through, take the tour, and leave thinking that Dr. Farnsworth was a man. And that was, totally unfair. Those who did a little bit of reading about her would find that she was relegated to the footnotes, that she was often mischaracterized and misunderstood. And she turns out to be a very fascinating person. And those of you who read the Architecture Press or even the Chicago Tribune might have heard that for the last 2 years, we really celebrated her life with Edith Farnsworth Reconsidered. And the culmination of that was a rededication of the house last November on what would have been her 118th birthday, and the official renaming of the house. And our little tagline, clearly original, will make sense to you as you go through the presentation. Not only are we one of the first glass houses in the United States, we are probably the most important glass house in Mies van der Rohe's career. And certainly Dr. Farnsworth realized that she was not only a client, but a patron. Because when Mies emigrated to the United States in 1938, he didn't really have much work other than designing the master plan and ongoing campus buildings at IIT. But time after again, he would present concepts to clients, residential clients, and they would decide not to move forward. Too daring, too expensive, too cold, too stark, what have you. Anyway, so Edith Farnsworth really kind of took a chance. I should say, though, that she first hired Keck and Keck. She interviewed Keck and Keck, and they interviewed her. They said, we're professionals. We can't drag this thing on. Once you sign off on the design program, we design your house, and that's what you get. And she had never been involved with any sort of construction or design project, and she really wanted to be part of the plan. So she was very fortunate in the beginning to be involved with Mies van der Rohe. And then those of you who know the story know that he kind of cut her out of the design process at one point. So that was the beginning of the end. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So here's the Farnsworth House. Probably most of you know it. And this was a picture taken 2 summers ago during Edith Farnsworth Reconsidered. So those hinky little octagonal planters on the terrace there, that's actually what she had. We based everything on photographs from 1955. Her foo dogs, for those of you who go to the University of Chicago campus, are now at the entrance to the Cochran Woods Arts Center, but they're huge and they are bolted to concrete footings, well, actually attached with titanium rods. So we couldn't get her actual foo dogs, but we had near replicas. And it's built on the site, you might not know this, of Colonel McCormick's Yorkville farms or experimental farms. So Colonel Robert R. McCormick had his Cantini estate at Wheaton, and then another 12 to 1,300 acres at Yorkville. And I always say nothing smellier than a horse at Wheaton, at Winfield, and everything else was out. The pigs, the cows, the chickens were all out of Yorkville. And he was very interested in scientific farming. And then, of course, he was a staunch Republican. And during FDR's administration, during the Depression, really, he was afraid that small farmers would kind of become new dealers. So he really staffed the Yorkville farms, rebranded it the Chicago Tribune Experimental Farms, and wrote a lot of kind of folksy stories where he worked in, his staff writers worked in sort of scientific agriculture to help small farmers survive the Depression. So increasing crop yields, increasing soil fertility, planting fruiting trees and shrub rows to attract birds, to reduce your insect populations. This is pre-chemical use, really. Pardon my dog in the background there. And so a lot of that stuff is sort of precursor to Edith Farnsworth. So by the time she found the site in 1944, they had stopped vegetable gardening on this site that was part of the experimental farms, but it was already graded flat and there was a well. So it was a perfect house site. So this I just throw in to show you some of our current visitors. Of course, we get a lot of architecture students from around the world. And one of our big annual visits is from Uruguay. They bring a group, well, pretty much every year, and they descend upon us. So they take over all the tours, sometimes for 2 days, but we get from all around the world. It's really become a pilgrimage site for architects, design lovers, and has been really since before it was built, because in 1947, before they even turned a shovel full of earth, the model of the Farnsworth House was exhibited at Mies Career Retrospective at MoMA, and curated by Philip Johnson, who was jokingly, called Philip Vander Johnson because he was such a Mies van der Rohe fan. And so the young architects right after the war were coming from all over the East Coast and beyond, really studying this exhibition. They loved Mies, they loved Miesian modernism and the international style. And so this model of the Farnsworth House caused quite a stir. So really, we're probably on, maybe our 5th generation of architect who, and also designers who have studied the Farnsworth House. We have a very active educational program at Farnsworth. Of course, we do a lot of archites, as we call them, Sunday afternoon. I jokingly refer to them as the football widows entertainment because they kind of coincide with Sunday afternoon sports, but alternative, I suppose. But this year and next, we're focusing on Peter Palumbo, the second owner of Farnsworth House from 1972 to 2003. He actually bought it from Edith Farnsworth in 1968, but they were both very clever with their money. And she had a lot of inheritance tax burdens, and he had restrictions on the amount of money that he could invest outside of the UK without being taxed heavily. So they worked out kind of a 4-year payment plan. And the final payment was actually a lifetime scholarship. So Edith Farnsworth retired to Italy in 1968, but in 1972, she bought a 15th century villa where she lived out her last 7 years translating modern Italian poetry into the English language. And some of her translations were included in a Pulitzer Prize winning volume of modern poetry by Eugenio Montale, after her death, unfortunately. But she had quite a life. She was really a remarkable person. So this just gives you sort of a smattering of some of our current programming and exhibitions. We do 4 gallery exhibitions a year in our Barnsworth Gallery, and jokingly called Barnsworth because when Lord Palumbo built the Visitor Center, he decided, well, why would you compete with Mies van der Rohe? So he made it a barn, and then our gallery is a silo, is a corn crib, if you will. So sort of vernacular, Midwestern vernacular, but we make good use of that gallery space. We also have a new Creative in Residence program, and it's 18 months long, and our current Creative in Residence is David Wallace Haskins. And if any of you have been to the Elmhurst Art Museum, you might have seen his Sky Cube, which is really a wonderful thing. And we have a larger version at Farnsworth. I'll show you pictures at the end. So the familiar story of girl meets boy, boy plays hard to get. This is all a bunch of hooey, but this is the kind of thing that has been repeated over and over the years. And really, it wasn't about that at all. The falling out of their relationship was mostly over money, but it was also because, as I say, at some point, Mies van der Rohe really kind of stopped listening to Edith Farnsworth, and she wasn't about to tolerate that. She was a very headstrong, successful woman. She was a polymath. She was brilliant. She taught herself 7 languages over the course of her lifetime, played classical violin. She went to Rome, to the conservatory, to study under the foremost classical violinist in the 1920s, Mario Corti. She was not about ready to be swept under the rug by Mies van der Rohe or any man for that matter. She never married, never had children. She was a consummate professional. She really was a proto-feminist. So I encourage you, if you haven't already heard of the book Broken Glass, that's a wonderful book, only a couple of years old, written by Alex Beam from the Boston Globe. And it's an easy read. It's a Penguin book. And then there's a new book about Edith Farnsworth you can buy on our website, but I'll tell you folks, you can actually read it for free. If you go to our landing page and go to the far right side and scroll down, you'll see Edith B. Farnsworth. And that's a wonderful little booklet published last year by Nora Wendell in commemoration of the renaming. So the National Trust is really about telling the full American story. That is what we're focused on. So the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is a big program right now. Of course, Where Women Made History is another program. Our National Main Street Center has been going since the 1970s. So that's really about helping rural communities. So it's really about celebrating the underdog, I think, in many ways. I think renaming the Farnsworth House, the Edith Farnsworth House, was very important to the National Trust. So we know these 2 characters, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. And I tell everybody, as famous as Mies is in Chicago, he's not well known outside of Chicago in the United States. Certainly in Germany, in Spain, he's very well known. China, to an extent, Italy. So he's no better known in Europe, of course, than he is in the United States. He's overshadowed a bit by Frank Lloyd Wright here in the Midwest. Didn't build as prolifically as Frank Lloyd Wright. And really, there are only 3 single-family homes designed by Mies in the United States. One is the Elmhurst Art Museum, which was the Robert S. McCormick House, and that was moved, you might remember, back in the early 1990s. The Farnsworth House, of course, was the first. And then there's a house in Connecticut, I think, that was designed by Mies. So here's Mies looking at his model of the Farnsworth House in that 1947 retrospective. And in the background, you'll see a sketch for a building that looks a little bit like the Farnsworth House on steroids. And that was a house that was to be built outside of Indianapolis. And I always tell everybody, if that had been built, we would all be going there and not to Plano, Illinois, because it was really quite something. And if it had been built. And there on the right-hand side is young Philip Johnson with Mies at that 1947 retrospective. Here we see Mies again with Philip Johnson. He was really kind of important to Mies's American career. And I don't know how many of you have been to his glass house, the Philip Johnson glass house, which is also owned by the National Trust. And it's not quite a copy of the Farnsworth House, but he freely admitted, Philip Johnson, that it was very much inspired by the Farnsworth House. Of course, Philip Johnson had Daddy's Alcoa aluminum stock behind him throughout his whole life. So he got it built before Dr. Farnsworth could, who was waiting for an $18,000 inheritance from one of her aunts. But of course, that was a lot more money in 1949 or 47 than it is now. So, of course, it has inspired all sorts of Farnsworth copycats or Farnsworth House lookalikes around the world. This is a David Hovey house on the upper left down here in Homewood. So even David Hovey isn't above copying Mies van der Rohe. Of course, he went to school at IIT, so that makes sense. But they're all around the world. If you ever have some time, just Google Farnsworth House lookalikes or houses inspired by Farnsworth House, and you'll see them all over the world. This is a famous quote by Mies van der Rohe, and it really touches upon the integration of nature and architecture that is so integral to the Farnsworth House experience. It's really a pavilion set in nature. I jokingly say it's almost like the one floor of one of his, high rises on Lakeshore Drive that was dropped by helicopter into the river woodlands in Plano. And, it really is a marvelous integration of architecture and nature throughout the seasons. It changes throughout the day as the light changes, throughout the seasons. So if you've been, it's time to come back. If you haven't been, then please, by all means, come to visit this year. So this is the Farnsworth House taken from the entrance, and you can see a few things here that are of interest. The doors are actually off center. The whole house is about asymmetrical balance. Mies was a classicist first and foremost, but stripped down classicist, and he really understood asymmetrical balance, and he used it in very subtle ways to kind of shift your focus, shift your movement. So if you really have time to study the design of Farnsworth House, you'll really, I think, take some delight in seeing that not everything is symmetrically balanced. But it has that initial impression. The furniture is actually from the 1970s, and it was introduced by the second owner, Peter Palumbo. Dr. Farnsworth did not have Mies van der Rohe furniture. She thought it was uncomfortable. She said it was designed in the 1920s. We're now in the 1950s. Why would I have 30-year-old furniture in my house? Much to Mies's chagrin. He was very much like Frank Lloyd Wright and wanted all of his houses to be furnished with his furniture designs. Well, and in truth, most of his furniture designs are not by Mies van der Rohe. They were designed in partnership with Lily Reich. So he was not exactly, in many ways, the nicest guy, as we've come to find out over the years, but successful certainly, and a cornerstone in the history of modern design. So here are some photographs from Edith Farnsworth Reconsidered. This is how the house was furnished over the last 2 years. And they were, the furnishings were based on historic photographs. And it was really sort of a combination of Scandinavian modern and Italian modern furniture. Edith taught or learned Italian from, I think, the age of 8, because she was studying Italian music and she wanted to learn the language. This is the story of her life. When she withdrew from the conservatory, she hitchhiked through Europe. I mean, this was the 1920s. And she landed on a farm in Germany studying regional German dialects. So she was a very heady person, but she was also a tremendously talented poet and translator. Her poems were generally published in the Northwestern Quarterly. She was a doctor at Passavant Memorial. She was a professor of kidney disease at Passavant at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, taught, and she also had an active research lab. And one of the things that she's not known for, unfortunately, is that AZH, the enzyme that she used for kidney treatment, became part of the research for prednisone. So had she been better recognized for her contributions to prednisone research, we would still, perhaps recognize her today for that contribution. But she really dedicated her career to medicine and to kidney disease in particular. This is one of our installations by Luftwerk. They've done 2 light installations at Farnsworth, really terrific. This was right around Halloween time a couple of years ago, so I said it was our upmarket haunted house. But it was a lot of fun. People really enjoyed it. It had a very sort of cerebral soundtrack composed by a Spanish Oriol Tarago, who has done soundtracks for many films. So it was really a stunning installation, and hopefully we'll have them back. It seems like they'd like to come back to Farnsworth, every so often. So we're delighted to have them. Here are some photographs from our current refurnishing. This is actually how Peter Palumbo had the house. Peter Palumbo, so those of you who don't know, is still with us. He's a fascinating character. And I think he'll be coming to the Arts Club in late July or early August. So stay tuned, watch our website for that. But he's quite a collector. And so the Farnsworth House was a little cluttered when he had it. He didn't actually live there. It was a guest house. He had about 1,200 acres in Plano, had a restored Victorian house in Plano, where he and the family would stay. But a lot of famous architects and artists stayed at the Farnsworth House during his years of ownership. And it's fascinating history. we jokingly, because Farnsworth House is everywhere. I mean, gosh, you'll see it in the papers all the time. But a little funny little, memes show up on the internet. This cat sleeping on top of the Farnsworth House. The Where's Bernie? Somebody put on, sitting on the porch of Farnsworth House. This Thomas Kincaid, sort of antithetical to what the Farnsworth House is about, but that was a little joke there. And this is the late Virgil Abloh, who absolutely loved. If you knew him, he was, as his brand was Off-White, and he was, of course, a designer of menswear for Louis Vuitton. But he absolutely loved the Farnsworth House. So whenever he would do a shout out to the Farnsworth House, our social media would just go through the roof. So we've had some good friends in high places over the years. We recently, in recent years, started doing yoga and family day, and we have a new canoe and kayak landing. We encourage plein air painters. We have benches on the grounds, picnic tables. So you still have to pay admission. It's only $10 to come in and use the grounds only. And I encourage people to do that because we have Wi-Fi at the house, and you can actually take a virtual tour and see the exhibition guide and look through the windows. So if you don't feel like paying for a $25 docent-led tour, you can have the $10 version. It's pretty good. So here's a picture of what the site looked like before the house was built. So if you guys could zoom in there, which I don't think I can do, that is Mies van der Rohe on the left, and the very tall person is Edith Farnsworth. She was 6 feet tall. And then the far right is Alfred Caldwell. And those of you who know the Evanston Arts Center grounds and all of that history, Alfred Caldwell was the job site foreman on that project. He worked for Jens Jensen all over the North Shore. He then went, of course, to IIT and taught under Mies van der Rohe. So in the beginning, he was going to be involved with the project. But of course, when the lawsuit happened, he had to take Mies's side, and so he really didn't do much landscape work at Farnsworth in the end. But as I say, this was already graded. It was a vegetable garden site, and then by the time Edith Farnsworth saw it in 1944, it was overgrown with asters and goldenrods and grasses. It was just a beautiful meadow. So this is actually the first visit to the site, and this photograph was taken by Edward Duckett, and it's in the Duckett Papers at the Art Institute. So we are so lucky to have it. There's Dr. Farnsworth on the left. I always liken her to Jane Hathaway from Beverly Hillbillies, if any of you remember that sitcom from the 60s. I think she was a little bit fun-loving. She was tall and gangly, super intellectual, but very accommodating. She was always packing picnic lunches for the boys in Mies's office. She would take the young architects and their wives out to jazz clubs in Chicago. So she really enjoyed the design process. Here she is picnicking on, that's with Hilberseimer and John Duckett and Mies at the Farnsworth House. They would oftentimes go out to the job site. Here she is in Mies's office on Ohio Street with Myron Goldsmith. He was really the chief project architect for the house. But several architects, including Alfred Caldwell, worked on the drawings over the years because they kind of took their time. And she kind of liked that because she really wanted the best out of Mies. And of course, she wasn't paying the bill. Mies had very early on said, this is a project for my students. And then he opened his office and had young architects working on the house. But then in the end, of course, he sent her a bill for design fees, and she was already over budget on the project. She said, I'm not paying this. So Mies sued her, put a lien on the house, and she countersued for malpractice because there were a lot of problems with this house when it was finished. She started dragging Mies's name through the mud, essentially. She went to University of Chicago with Elizabeth Gordon, who was the editor at Beautiful, so she had an inside track. Of course, Elizabeth Gordon loved Frank Lloyd Wright, so any chance she had to kind of smear Mies van der Rohe, she took advantage of, as did Frank Lloyd Wright. So it really got to be ugly. But then again, it kept the Farnsworth House in the papers throughout the 1950s. So it's really always been sort of a cornerstone of American design history. Here's a photograph from her ACTH lab at Northwestern. She was really at the top of her game in '49, about the time that she was working with Mies van der Rohe, who was, of course, at the top of his game, really, at the time. So really a meeting of two great minds. Here's the catalog for the 1947 exhibition. And it turns out that Edith Farnsworth wrote a chapter for the catalog. It wasn't published, though. It was much better written than what was published. But that was an interesting discovery too. So here's Mies, of course. Here's Dr. Farnsworth on the right. And this is one of her, at the time, good friends. This was Bill Dunlap's wife, Elizabeth Dunlap, and Beth Dunlap. And she and Bill were good friends until she found out that Bill was going behind her back and showing Mies the designs for the screen porch and the wardrobe. And she absolutely went to Bill so that Mies wouldn't be involved with those designs. So that was kind of the end of that. But Bill made out okay. He became sort of head of SOM's California office. So he really did well over the years. And that's Miss Amy. So she had poodles. She had a silver poodle and a black poodle when she built the house. The silver poodle passed, but she only spoke to her dogs in French because she didn't want anybody else giving her dogs commands. So this is the kind of eccentric person Dr. Farnsworth was. She also gave commands to her friends. She had a very commanding personality. I think being a doctor, she was just used to giving orders, and her friends came to love it. I mean, that was just sort of her characteristic. Here she is lounging on the rocks with some of her gal pals in Castine, Maine. The family summered in Castine, Maine while she was growing up. She attended Miss Hall's boarding school in Massachusetts. We don't know if she was lesbian, bisexual. We kind of suspect, though, because she was good friends with Harry Mies and his wife. And at one point, his wife told John Vinci that Edith Farnsworth is a lesbian, but keep that under your hat. So I take John pretty seriously on that. But of course, she couldn't be out. She was a sign of two wealthy families, both her mother and father's side, and it was of course the era. And then the pressure of her job. I mean, she was in a man's world. Can you imagine what would have happened if the word would have gotten out? So anyway, she was a fascinating person. And I think that is just sort of subtext to the entire story. Here are some construction photos. Mies ended up being the general contractor for the house as well as the architect because he really couldn't find anybody to build the thing. It was after World War II, materials and supply chain were still goofed up, sounds familiar, and beginning of the Korean War. So it was really to be built to Mies's satisfaction. Of course, Edith wasn't paying that bill either. He paid for the construction, but she wasn't paying for Mies's job site foreman, sort of responsibilities. So this really was a labor of love for all involved. Here's the summer the house was completed, so 1951, before the screens were installed. So this is how the house looks now, but for the most part during Edith Farnsworth's tenure, this was a screened porch. So the second owner, Peter Palumbo, here we see him here with Margaret Thatcher, political and financial conservative, but socially liberal. Very fascinating man. Here he is, one of the House of Lords ceremonies. He was inducted to the House of Lords or elevated to a Lord by Margaret Thatcher. He was chairman of the British Arts Council. He was on the board of every museum and gallery in the UK at one time or another. He really has devoted his life to architecture and the arts. Here he is his hero, Mies van der Rohe, taken in the 1950s when he came to London. And this was really the kind of, this actually might have been early 60s when he was working on Mansion House Square. So he was meeting with the Bank of London because he was going to design Mansion House Square, a real estate development very similar to Illinois Center, but on a slightly smaller scale, which was being developed by Peter and his father. So that's how he first came to be connected with Mies van der Rohe. Here, of course, is a current photograph of Peter, who's now well into his 80s. Fascinating person. He's lived a very fascinating life. He was chairman of the Pritzker Prize in Architecture for over a decade, so you may know his name in association with that as well. Here he's with Princess Diana, and so you might see a Peter Palumbo lookalike in The Crown, in this season of The Crown, or in the Princess Diana movies, but he was very close to Diana, also with Fergie. I jokingly say he won both of them in the divorces. He's actually a godfather to Princess Beatrice, who just married a couple years ago. And he doesn't have anything to do with Prince Charles because even though they used to play polo together, Prince Charles was really kind of the nail in the coffin for the Mansion House Square. Speaking at the RIBA Centennial, Royal Institute of British Architects, he said, Peter Palumbo's latest proposal for central London is is a giant glass stump better suited to the skyline of Chicago. Well, that was all it took. Basically the preservations had won the day at that point. And so in the end, years and years of design. I mean, Mies even designed the doorknobs and the ashtrays. So really it was going to be a Mies masterpiece. But in the end, it was the James Stirling design that was built, which then Prince Charles said looked like a 1930s wireless set. And Prince Charles said, I'm sorry, Peter Palumbo came out in the press and said, well, I own several 1930s wireless sets and they're absolutely beautiful. So I take that as a compliment. But anyway, so there we see him with Fergie and her daughters. This is actually at Peter's eldest daughter's wedding, I think Petra's wedding. And there he is with his second wife, Hyatt Palumbo. They married in 1986. She's absolutely lovely. Those of you who know the Middle Eastern news service, Al Hayat, that was her father. So Hyatt Life Force is named for the news service, actually. And he was unfortunately assassinated when she was in her upper teens. She moved to Paris and was schooled in Paris. So avoided a lot of the chaos in Lebanon, but she, of course, has supported a lot of causes in Lebanon, and Beirut specifically, over the years. These are the big three. So Farnsworth House, Kentuck Knob by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is near Fallingwater, and then the Maison Jules by Le Corbusier in Paris. These were Peter's three gems. He also had an apartment at the Carlisle in New York, a condominium at 80 Lakeshore Drive, a country house, well, two country houses, one after another in England, and then of course his townhouse in Chelsea. Oh, and Seven Islands off of the coast of Scotland. So, he was really a land baron at the time. He eventually sold the Farnsworth House in Maison Jules and kept Kentuck Knob as their sort of American base. So it's open to the public. If you haven't been, it's absolutely wonderful house. And there's a lot of Farnsworth history there too, because he's very proud of the fact that he once owned the Farnsworth House. So you'll see sketchbooks and a lot of references to Farnsworth when you take the Kentuck Knob tour. A lot of famous people, of course, visited Farnsworth and stayed there. That's Zaha Hadid at the upper left. She was there probably 3 different times. She did a conceptual design for a museum and visitor center building for Farnsworth that was never built, unfortunately. I really wish it had been. There's James and Amesha Wood. You probably remember when Jim was president of the Art Institute. Hyatt and Peter were big supporters of the Art Institute and the CSO whenever they were in Chicago. And interestingly, the couple to the right, I recently found out who they were. It's drawing a blank right now, but it's a name that you would all know in England if I mentioned it. Sainsbury's. So if you have traveled to, they're kind of, like the 7-Eleven, a little bit more upscale in England. Those were the Sainsbury's who came to Farnsworth to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. The lower photo, that's Richard Gray, that's Myron Goldsmith. The Grays and the Goldsmiths were frequent visitors. That's Hyatt there with a wonderful Claes Oldenburg sculpture. Peter had a wonderful outdoor sculpture collection. Some of you might have seen it. It was really there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's all gone now. Many of the pieces were taken to Kentuck Knob before he sold the house in 2003. But it was really quite a place during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He added a boathouse, a tennis court, swimming pool, riding trails. There's 60 acres there. And as I said, he had 1,200 acres, 4 other farms. So he would bring horses over. He'd have horses brought over so that his guests could ride or his kids could ride. So it was really quite a hopping place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I always thought that the kids had plastic canoes or kayaks that they would take out on the river. Oh no, he had 19th century skiffs brought over from England, mahogany with brass fittings, had them fully restored. I mean, that's just how Peter is. Everything to Peter is about design. And until he dies, that's all it will be. So anyway, Henry Moore, Calder, I mean, just on and on. The sculptures were at Farnsworth at that time were really magnificent. So he, of course, spent a lot of money restoring the Farnsworth House. Edith did not maintain it very well, frankly. And especially in the 1960s, which he was constantly fighting Northwestern Hospital and the state of Illinois, who was taking 2 acres of her land through eminent domain. but also to build a new bridge and straighten out the highway to the west of her house. But her neighbors were losing even more money. So it was a group effort. They tried suing 3 different ways. In 1967, I mean, the bulldozers were pretty much moving already, and they tried a legal tactic, which today would have stopped those bulldozers dead in their track, because the Antiquities Act was only 1 year old, and they found basically Native American bones all over her property. But the state covered them up. That was their response, that we're not disturbing them, we're covering them up. But anyway, such were the times. But anyway, then of course the house flooded in 1997, had 6 feet of water in the house. So Peter had to restore the house again. And so then he tried to sell the property to the state of Illinois. Some of you might remember that, as a house museum and sculpture park. Jim Edgar agreed on an $8 million price. Then George Ryan came in and tried to play the hero and tried to negotiate a lower price over and over. The state was in such financial trouble during the Ryan administration, as was he, of course. Finally, in about 2000, Lisa Madigan pulled the plug and said, we're just never going to be able to justify the expense. Peter subsequently removed all the sculptures and had Sotheby's auction the property as a work of art. I think it was the first time Sotheby's has taken that tactic, but since then, several important houses have been sold as works of art. So he's a very clever man. Here's Farnsworth, I think, during its heyday under Palumbo. Beautiful photograph by a British photographer. This magnificent maple is gone, unfortunately. It was on life support when Peter Palumbo bought the property in '72. He spent a fortune trying to keep it alive and it survived until 2013. It was cabled, fertilized, injected, annually pruned, but it was just constantly dropping limbs on the roof of the house. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but it would just, on a quiet summer's day with no breeze, it would drop a limb for absolutely no reason. So it had to come down eventually. So Landmarks Illinois and the National Trust acquired the property at auction in 2003 and opened to the public in 2004. And then this last picture here I want to show you, this is the work of David Wallace Haskins, who's our current artist in residence or creative in residence. This is a piece called Image Continuous, which is the name of one of Dr. Farnsworth's poems. And it's like the Tetris from Doctor Who. It just looks like this strange foreign object that's dropped into the woodlands in Plano. And it's a mirrored cube, so it changes as you walk around it, but the angle of the mirror inside that circular cutout reflects the sky. So you watch the clouds pass by, and that changes color and motion, throughout the weather, changes of the weather. So it's fascinating. This is the first of, I think, 3 or 4 sculptures that David will be installing over the course of his residency. So if you come out this spring, you'll have to come back this fall to see more work. And that's the final slide, so thank you.
Scott, thank you so much. It was just wonderful. So if I'm going to ask a few questions that have come through, and then I'm also going to remind folks that if they want to, they may use the feature to raise their hand, and we'll see them.
And should I stop sharing? You want me to stop sharing the screen?
Why don't you? Because then we'll have an easier time having a. Thank you. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so first my question, because of course I'm the director, the executive director of a historic house museum. So this is kind of Eden to Scott. How do you like working at the Farnsworth House? What's that? What is that like? Such a famous what does that feel like? And tell me, all of us, maybe a little bit about your day to day, what that's like going to work at the Edith Farnsworth House.
Yeah, we have to get used to that. Well, of course, it's one of 28 sites now owned by the National Trust. So we have a combination, those of you who are National Trust members already know this. We have a combination of stewardship sites and co-stewardship sites. Stewardship sites are generally owned part and parcel by the National Trust, run by the National Trust. The Farnsworth House is one of them. So I'm really a National Trust employee. Co-stewardship sites usually are run by their own 501c3, but the land and the property, is owned by the National Trust. So there's different models. And we have 2 president's houses. Most of the president's houses are National Park Service sites. So we oftentimes get that. And how does the National Trust decide which properties to acquire or accept? That's often a question. And one answer is that they've tried to have a diverse range of architectural styles and periods of history across the United States. There are actually 3 modern houses in the portfolio: the Farnsworth House, the Philip Johnson Glass House, and a Marcel Breuer House, which is on the grounds of Kyket, the Rockefeller estate in New York. But you don't hear about the other 2 as much, at least not in the Midwest, and that's perfectly fine with me.
I feel like certainly the Glass House and this and Edith Farnsworth are definitely the more famous of the houses.
Sure.
And maybe the Glass House is only because me and several of the people on this call happen to be, you know, have a keen interest in architecture.
Terrific.
All right, but you didn't answer. What's it like? What does it feel
Oh,
like to be the
well,
executive director of the Edith Farnsworth House?
well, a little bit like I'm in the hot seat. But those of you who are Morton Arboretum longtime members or supporters know that I was in the crosshairs there for many years because it was a very quiet, sleepy place. And when I was hired, we really shook things up. And so, whether you like it or not, the Morton Arboretum has become the Chicago Botanic Garden of the Western suburbs, and I had a large role to play in that. So if I had more money at Farnsworth, I think I'd be dangerous. So having no money tempers my enthusiasm a bit. We kind of have to earn what we spend, but we are really making, great strides within the limits of our budget.
Well, I'm very impressed. I wish I'm going to ask my colleague Jenny that when she posts this and shares it, she shares also, because I'll find it when I get to work tomorrow, the photo of when my colleagues and I took a field trip. I told you we took an awesome field trip to the home. Okay, I also want to get one other question. I thought I had heard talk of a movie based on the book you mentioned. Is that a thing, or did I make that up?
No, it's a thing. It's still a thing. It was announced, about 5 years ago, and it's had several changes of cast. Well, 2 changes of cast. I shouldn't say several. But what happened was during the pandemic, the airlines canceled all their pre-buys, and the project developers for a lot of the sort of art films lost funding because when the pre-buys pull out, a lot of the investors pull out. So now there's a backlog in Hollywood where a lot of these projects are in line, to be greenlighting. The challenge is that with the Farnsworth project is it's still not really known on the West Coast. It's primarily known in the Midwest on the East Coast. So everybody who reviews it in Hollywood says, this is kind of provincial. No one's going to go, blah, blah. So it's a challenge. The current cast is Elizabeth Debicki as Edith Farnsworth. She's currently playing Princess Diana, so there's a nice little connection there. And also the Ray Fiennes is playing Mies van der Rohe. And those of you who think of him as like back in the 90s with his swoopy hair and a waifish little, he's very built now, so I can see him carrying off Mies van der Rohe. So I hope the project happens. It would really help.
Yeah, I think it'd be amazing. In my opinion, and even I was thinking this when you said about the Morton, more is more, right? We want these.
Right.
No pun intended. That was. Does anybody not know why we're laughing? Of course, Scott, you want to tell them why?
Oh yeah, less is more. Mies is all times, yeah. He actually didn't coin that phrase, but he did use it a lot. So that's right. Really
less is more. So I was not trying to be funny, but sometimes I just can't help it. Okay, maybe I should move on from myself. Okay, so here's a question. Do you have an idea what's the significance of the food dogs? Moira points out that in Allerton Park near Champaign, which oh my gosh, you must be very familiar with from your school.
I actually worked there.
So are you familiar with the food dogs, excuse me, on the columns, and is there some relationship?
I don't know. So, of course, Robert Allerton sold, when he gave the property to the University of Illinois in 1946, he had a very large collection. Um, Most of his things he donated to museums, but he did have a big sale, not only of art, but of furnishings. And some of his furnishings actually were purchased by Mrs. McCormick and are in Cantini. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, the Robert Allerton collection was a big deal in 1946 in Chicago. Colby's had many floors dedicated to the furniture from his collection. He also, interestingly, back when the Brits had a terrible economy, he was one of those terrible Americans that went and bought all these rooms torn out of British castles and donated to the Art Institute. They were mostly warehoused, but those of you who know the history of the Art Institute, there were period rooms on display from time to time. Those were sold too. But the food dogs, really, Allerton was, yeah, a big collector of Asian antiquities. And Edith was a Farnsworth, and Harley Farnsworth McNair and his wife were directors of the Oriental Institute at University of Chicago. So we think there was a family connection we haven't fully solved yet. But yeah, for some reason, she started collecting Chinese antiquities in the 40s, had them in her apartment in Chicago and at the Farnsworth House.
It's so interesting, the connections, and I have to, the fact that we keep asking questions that you have a very particular expertise in. So thanks for sharing.
Well, just coincidence.
Yeah. um, I had a question that I was just about to, oh, tell me about the staff. What's the staff like? And how do you maintain this, that space?
Yeah, so we have, let's see, 3 full-time staff, myself as executive director and curator, the operations manager, and then our senior assistant of exhibitions and programs. The rest of our staff is all part-time. So even our facilities maintenance tech is part-time to maintain 5 buildings and 60 acres, and he gets 20 hours a week. So it's a challenge during mowing season because he's riding the lawnmower a lot.
Yeah.
So in the winter, before the grass starts growing, we throw a lot of stuff at it. But
Yeah.
we also have, of course, our guides are all paid guides. We don't have volunteer guides. Our docents are paid. A lot of retired folks who just, don't go for the money. They're basically just paying for their gas these days, but they like to be with the public and they like sharing their knowledge. And there are a lot of retired teachers. So if anybody, we're looking for guides right now, if anybody wants a part-time job, or knows somebody who lives closer to us, because we're quite a drive from Evanston. Anyway, that's kind of our staffing situation.
Okay. How would you say the things that in Chicago people are familiar with are obviously Mises lakefront buildings, the IIT campus, and then I would say also the Edith Farnsworth House. So how does the Edith Farnsworth House fit within Mises Chicago collection?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the early sketches for Farnsworth House, there's a version in there that looks a lot like Crown Hall. So it's interesting that not only was it a design build project for Mies, and he worked out the details on site in many instances, those same details were used over and over again throughout the remainder of his life. So it really was an important project, not only to Mies's career, but to the history of American architecture, history of Miesian modernism. And the column spacing is the exact same as 868-80. So he basically used that same module. The McCormick House is different because he kind of combined what he learned at IIT with the Cream City brick walls and with what he did at Farnsworth House. But he worked with like Frigidaire, for example, to design a lower cost refrigerator stove fan unit. And so it's really a partnership between himself and the developer to develop this house that turned out not to be affordable. If you know the history of the Elmer's Art Museum, that was their concept. There were going to be 3 subdivisions with these Miesian single-family houses, and it wasn't developed. The developer Greenwald was killed in a crash, and that was the end of that. But yeah, there definitely are similar materials. modules, massing in all of Mies's projects.
So interesting. All right, I'm going to read a couple questions, so bear with me while I go back to my screen. I know everyone's wondering, what are the latest plans to raise the house in case of flooding and or prep flooding? You know, the flooding story in the Farnsworth House are famous. So
I know, like it happens every so many years.
I'm sure it keeps you up. Honestly, I know from the dog, it keeps you up at night.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, we have well-established flood protocols, and anytime the river starts to go over its banks, of course, all staff is on alert. And then we actually, at some point, turn off the power to the house, put the security system on battery backup, raise the curtains in contractor bags, and put all the furniture up off the floor on milk crates. So now we actually have the Palumbo era wardrobe back in the house, which was in the gallery for many years. And we have it sitting on rolled up pond liner that's tucked underneath, and it actually just pulls up and forms a giant rubber cup in case of, so we're really concerned about flooding. But the long-term plan is a hydraulic lift system.
That's what I
is about a $7.5 million project, but it's brilliant. You'll never see it. There's even a tray of dirt on top of it so that it looks exactly like it does now. So it takes 45 minutes to raise the house 8.5 feet in the air, 8.5 feet above where it is now, which is at 5'3". So it's really, frankly, a bit of overkill. But if they were going to do the system, they wanted to do it for all time. And it's 19th century technology controlled by 21st century electronics. So presumably by time 22nd century electronics are here, the mechanicals, basic mechanicals will still work. So
yeah. Well, I hope that happens.
If anyone would like to write a check for 7.5 million, I'd be
delighted. No, Scott, these are my people.
That's true.
Stay
you
away.
need 7.5 million too.
I do.
Split it, Eden. We'll each take 3 million. No problem.
You are brilliant. Exactly as I expected.
No, I love the Dawes House. If I had more money, I'd definitely donate to it. It's a lovely structure.
Where are the guts of the building located? By the way, you have to take the tour and you will see, but the pipes, the electrical work, the heat, how do you heat it?
They're all squeezed into a closet behind the fireplace. So you enter it through, a door in the shower in the west bathroom. And it was brilliant because she was only there on the weekend. So if a plumbing leak happened during the week, the water would run under the door from the mechanical room and right down the showers. So that was pretty smart. Also, the whole house fan, because there was no air conditioning in the house until the 90s, was the intake is in the mechanical room, and that is right in line with the sink. So everything was well planned until the first time the furnace guy came and found out that there was only 12 inches gap, and he had to send his teenage son in there. And he said to Dr. Farnsworth, "Have you given the house a name yet?" And she said, "No, I haven't. Why?" And he said, "I think you should call it my Mies conception." He said, obviously, Mies has never had to service any of his own mechanicals because you would not design a room like this. It has a dual heating system and did from the start. It has forced air and radiant heat. And I can tell you it's $1,700 to $1,800 a month to heat in January and February because the heat just goes right out through the floor. So we had a blower test and heat infrared done by ComEd, and they said, well, the good news is you're not losing any heat through the ceiling.
Just everywhere else.
Just everywhere else. Anyway.
Well, here's a question maybe you never had before. How do you mow the grass under the house?
We don't, because there's no grass under the house. It's just plain dirt. Always was. Lord Palumbo, who was a bit of a neatnik, hired a high school kid every summer to plant vinca under the house. Of course, it would fill in over the course of the summer and then die in the winter. And he'd hire them to come back and do it next year. So it was a luxury. It was a little bit of a, but he just didn't like looking at bare dirt. But it's been bare dirt, since I don't know, the 90s.
And you told us how much it costs to heat the house. How much does it cost to cool the house?
Well, it's very expensive. Not that expensive, but ever since the tree came down, the big maple tree in 2013, the solar gain is tremendous. Thankfully, the curtains are wool, and they're the original curtains from 97 when the house was restored, and they're still in pretty good shape. So we can close them, and that helps really cut down the heat in the summertime.
I so I'm just firing questions at you.
Yeah,
So
sure.
what's to be made of the gossip about the love affair between Dr. Farnsworth and Mies van der Rohe? That was I know none of us really, her sexuality certainly means nothing to us, but
Yeah.
there was much made about a potential love affair, and then
Yes.
love turned sour and
Yeah.
project turned sour.
Well, we don't know. I mean, none of us were there, were we? Laura Marks was was Mises' Chicago girlfriend. Broke it off because they were both raging alcoholics, and she decided to go to AA, and he would never go. And she said, "Well, until you get your act together, we're off." So there was an opportunity, I suppose, to have a relationship at the time with Dr. Farnsworth. But my theory is that Laura Marks was a little younger and certainly much more vibrant than me. And he had back problems his whole life. He had arthritis. He was an alcoholic. She probably, wanted to have maybe more physical relationship than Mies was capable of. And all the boys in the office who were these young kids just made the biggest deal out of the fact that Mies is, putting it to Dr. Farnsworth, to put it crassly. I mean, that's really how they described it. So this rumor got started based on absolutely nothing, and Mies did nothing to discourage it. He, wanted to be the super stud. So I think that's really why this thing got started. I think they were each other's beards, frankly. I think socially she could not be out. She did have supposedly 3 men in her life that were important to her romantically. We don't know what the nature of their relationship was. Mies, she was certainly fascinated with. Mario Corti, when she was 19, 20, her violin instructor. They had a brief relationship. And then, of course, late in life, she absolutely fell head over heels with Eugenio Montale, the Italian poet. But I mean, they were both well into their 80s, and he was very decrepit and had a wife. So, it was a very sort of cerebral romance at that point, I think. So, anyway, we'll never know. But I'll tell you, Fairbank Carpenter, some of you might know him, he's a delightful man. That's Edith's nephew. And he said, my aunt was not sexually confused. So there you have it. That was, the family's attitude. So there's no way.
No, and nor is it. So much had been made over the years, and I get the feeling, though I hope I'm wrong, that if this movie is ever made, that's going to play a big part in it, whether it deserves.
It's very Hollywood. It's definitely
it makes for a better story than a really, really interesting woman and a really, really interesting man in a business relationship.
That's right.
So what's the ultimate on how did the court cases, how did the case and the suing and the countersuing, ultimately, what was the result?
Well, they were never in a courtroom. I mean, never in front of a jury. And now, of course, that's been, misconstrued over the years. Also, of course, in the movie, they will be in a jury in a courtroom, be a lot more dramatic. But it was a master of chancery. And they both went into the judge's quarters, delivered, their whatever, and other people were brought in to testify, and God, this thing went on forever. And then the judge retired, and another judge was brought in, and then she countersued, and then Mies, of course, started backpedaling because it was actually his accountant that encouraged him to put the lien on the house in the first place. And in the end, she paid the $2,500. So it was nominal. It was nothing. Of course, that was 1950, whatever that was, by the time she paid 50, or at least, so about 10 times the value. So maybe it was $25,000. But Fairbanks says, it wasn't my aunt had all the money in the world. It was a matter of principle. That's what angered her. That's what made her so angry. She didn't want to lose the lawsuit. She didn't care about the money.
So if you had you know, a hope. We know about the 7.5 million, but what's your future? What's the legacy of the house? How should, you know, in 25 years, whatever it is, some shortish amount of time, but presumably, you know, you're not the executive director. What's the legacy?
Right.
What's the future of the home?
Yeah, well, of course, Chicago continues its westward expansion. So I think, you know, in the 90s, the developers thought that Yorkville would be the next Naperville. Thank goodness that didn't happen, but it still may. So I think we are, just as the Morton Arboretum became the Chicago Botanic Garden for the near west suburbs, I think we have the potential to become much more than just a house museum in the coming decades. So we're positioning ourselves strategically, and it's really about architecture, art, and nature. And of course, none of that would be there if the nature didn't exist. If it wasn't a beautiful riverside setting surrounded by, you know, glacial moraines and oaks and so forth, she never would have been attracted to the site. And Mies would have never designed the house in that way if it hadn't been a beautiful site. So it's really our legacy. And so I think, you know, 25 years from now, hopefully we'll have some money in the bank and we'll have more staff, but we'll also have more visitors, and they'll be coming for many different reasons, not just for the architecture of the house.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic aspiration, not just because and achievable. So that's why it's extra fantastic. So that seems like a good place to maybe end our conversation, with very best wishes for continued success. And I hope you know how much we all appreciate the work you're doing at the Edith Farnsworth House, because without people like you, the legacy goes away, the house, the story, the all of it. So I thank you for being with us tonight, but really, truthfully, thank you for your incredible work with to preserve the story in the house.
Well, thank you, Eden, and thank you everybody for listening and attending.
Yeah,
And come
wonderful.
visit us.
Yeah, go if you have not visited. I really encourage you to visit. It's a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.